He's our rescuer. He's our rescuer. We are free from sin forevermore. Oh, how sweet the sound. Oh, how grace abounds. We will praise the Lord, our rescuer. There is good news for the captive, good news for the shamed. There is good news for the one who walked away. There is good news for the doubter, the one religion failed. For the good Lord has come to seek and save. He's our rescuer. He's our rescuer. We are free from sin forevermore. Oh, how sweet the sound. Oh, how grace abounds. We will praise the Lord, our rescuer. He is beauty for the blind man and riches for the poor. He is friendship for the one the world ignores. He is pasture for the weary and rest for those who strive. Oh, the good Lord is the way, the truth, the life. Yes, the good Lord is the way, the truth, the life. He's our rescuer. He's our rescuer. We are free from sin forevermore. Oh, how sweet the sound. Oh, how grace abounds. We will praise the Lord, our rescuer. So come and be chainless. Come and be fearless. Come to the foot of Calvary. For there is redemption for every affliction. Here at the foot of Calvary. So come and be chainless. Come and be fearless. Come to the foot of Calvary. There is redemption for every affliction. Here at the foot of Calvary. He's our rescuer. He's our rescuer. We are free from sin forevermore. Oh, how sweet the sound. Oh, how grace abounds. We will praise the Lord, our rescuer. You can have a seat. We'll continue singing here in a few minutes.
Good morning and welcome to Bethel Baptist Church. And whoever brought the snow, you can get it, okay? We're talking about spring, smiling spring. We're so glad you're here this morning. You are in the house of the Lord, and we've come to worship, and we want to be here for you and meet your needs. Now, while you're sitting there, take your bulletin or your worship guide, please, and that little card on the inside called communication card. Right now, get your name on it, all that information, and as we proceed through the service, if something comes up that you'd like to speak to Pastor Tim or myself about, or just prayer request, whatever it may be, let us know on that card. Very, very important. And I also want to remind you of the organizer. Sometimes we don't say enough about it, but this is our weekly newsletter, and it's for you. You can get it one of two ways, either by email, or you can pick one copy up as you go out the door to the left on the wall there. There's a rack with these organizers on there. Quite a bit of information about what's going on here at Bethel. We want these to be in your hand. If you would like to receive one on your communication card, let us know, and we'll be able to share that with you. If you'll just listen to the verse I'm going to read this morning, it says, Matthew chapter 5, verse 14 through 16, you are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel or a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Good verse for us this morning, isn't it? We are the light of the world. We keep saying this, that this church is a lighthouse in this community. And we believe that. We are the lights that bear the word to others. Would you stand with us for prayer as we begin our service this morning, as we pray together and then remain standing for the music. Lord, again, we just thank you for the Lord Jesus and for your blessings upon our lives. Lord, to know you as our Savior is one of the greatest honors we can have. And Lord, I pray that today, that as everyone here looks at their own heart and says, if they know the Lord or they have not, and certainly we want to help them find Christ. Lord, I pray that the message this morning will reach the hearts of everyone here. So we pray your blessing be upon the service, the needs here, Lord, as we pray together, as we worship our Savior together. May God be glorified in all we say and do. In Jesus' name we pray.
We want to look at these verses in 2 Corinthians and take what we read here from the Bible and utilize that understanding. And when we sing the song and see the foundation for the song that we're about to use to celebrate, it says this. It says, therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold, hope of a future with Christ. We're not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. When their minds were made dull, for this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed, because only in Christ is it taken away. So even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. The Lord is spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. And so we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. And we want to take those words and turn them to praise.
Turn our hearts with joy. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason we're singing. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. Your presence in this place, your glory on our face, we're looking to the sky. Descending like a cloud, you're standing with us now. Oh Lord, unveil our eyes. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason we're singing. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. Show us your glory. Show us your power. Show us your glory, Lord.
Let's sing that again.
Show us your glory. Show us your power. Show us your glory, Lord. And open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. So open up the heavens, defiant in your name. You are the fire that cannot be tamed. You are the power in our reigns, our Lord, our God, our conqueror.
Thank you for singing with us. You can have a seat. So I know I've said this before, but every time I carry this stand, I think to myself, don't look like it's heavy. Don't look like it's heavy. Like does it, don't struggle. This thing is heavier than it looks, though. Okay, so two things before we really get started. Thanks for being here. I'm really glad you're here. My mind is got a few things on it that I want to get out of the way, but I don't want to forget to say that. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you've taken today to come and join us, to celebrate with us, learn with us, grow with us. And so I'm glad you're here. If you're visiting with us, I hope you enjoy yourself. I hope you feel welcome. I hope you feel like part of the family already. And as always, I encourage you all to use those communication cards that Pastor Jerry mentioned to communicate with us, to express your thoughts, your prayer requests, your concerns, where you're at. It helps us, really helps us understand you and where you're coming from, what your needs are, helps us to really connect together as the leadership of the church with you. So a few things to get, like I said, a few things to get out of the way. Not get out of the way, but I want to mention. First is we have new mugs that we ordered for the church. I know it's hard to see from all the way back there, but these are the new mugs that we ordered. So if you want a new mug, this one's white, the other one was black. So if you want a contrasting set, they're $5 if you want to buy one. You just have to talk to Carrie Gleason or myself at some point, and you can buy one. We use these mugs. We actually use these mugs to give away to our guests. So if you want to buy one for a guest who you hopefully will meet someday, then you can pay $10 for a mug too if you want to do that. But if you just want a mug for yourself, they're $5. We'd encourage you to get them. Just make sure you hand wash these ones. Don't put these in the dishwasher necessarily. But we encourage you to get one and use it, or get one to give away. If you're a guest with us this morning, I don't think we have any of the white mugs, but if you want one, you can go ask for one. But we have some of the black mugs for you, and they're free. So if you're a guest, first time, second time, or you consider yourself a lifelong guest, I guess, these are free for you. So you can get one at the information desk, and if you really want a white one, we can wrestle one of those out for you. So that's just kind of by way of encouragement to remember the church while you drink your coffee. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you all should have gotten an email this week about We Serve coming up this Saturday. And in the email it said, if you want to participate, check one of the boxes. And some of you did that. You checked the box that said, I plan on coming, but I need a ride. Some of you said, I plan on coming, but I don't need a ride. The problem was there was no box to say who you were. So I have no idea who's coming. You volunteered, which is great. I need you to tell me though if you checked one of those boxes. So find me after the service. If you don't find me, find like I said, Carrie Gleason, and let us know. Say, hey, that was me, because otherwise it'll just be a mystery, and I'll say, I know this many people are coming. I just don't know who they are. So if you would just say, hey, I was one of them. That will help me out a lot. So this morning is our last week of kind of piggybacking off of our core value of worship. Next week is Communion Sunday, and next week we're going to we're going to focus only on communion. So we're going to pause from our core values series next week, and we're just going to talk about communion and celebrate communion with the service. And then the week after that, we'll come back to core values and start talking about community. But this week is our last week, just working through our core value of worship, or like I said, we're kind of piggybacking off of it. Let me just kind of bring you up to speed and remind you of where we're at as far as our understanding of what this core value really means. We believe that we as a church exist to worship God. Well, we believe that we as Christians, as people in general, we exist to worship God. But we believe that as a church, we exist to worship God. And so that means we are committed to pursue God's mission of reaching those who are far from God and reconciling relationships with God. And that is our first priority. That means that we want everything that we do as individuals and everything that we do as a church here on Sunday or whenever we meet together, we want those to be driven by that very purpose, because we don't think we're fully worshiping God as a church if we aren't reaching people who are far from God, if we aren't making more disciples, and we don't think that we're fully worshiping as a church, worshiping God, if we aren't helping reconcile people to God, if we aren't helping people work through what their salvation means and how that plays out in their lives as they grow. Teaching them to observe and obey after their rescue and making better disciples. That means that what we do when we meet is really driven by why we meet, to help more people know and serve God, to help people know and serve God more, to make more and better disciples. It means that we don't just preach just to preach, just to increase knowledge. We don't sing songs just to sing songs that make us happy. We don't pray just to pray because we're supposed to. We don't give just to give and have nicer buildings, although they might help. It means that our expressions of worship, our praise and service, our sacrifice, our submission, those are all driven by the desire to be a true worshiping church. And that must be affected by our mission of making more and better disciples, of helping more people know and serve God. So we're rounding out our 3-week discussion on this core value, and we're going to get really practical today, I hope. Now that we know that what we do should be driven by why we do it, right? What we do as an individual and as a church should be driven by our mission to make more and better disciples. We want to talk about, how does that look practically? So how does that look practically? How can we be most effective in pursuing that? And so I'll say this, I said this last week, but even more this week. If you're visiting with us, if you're a guest with us, you don't have to stop listening. This is kind of a family talk, though. For those of you who are regular attenders and members, this is kind of a family talk where we get to remind ourselves why we're here and what we're doing. And if you're a guest, you get to be a fly on the wall today and really get a good sense of what we're all about, because we're never going to apologize for what we're all about. And so today we'll give you a really, really good sense of who we are as a church. And so I'd say take notes, take advantage of this chance. Because we're going to have a kind of a family talk this morning. So we want to start by looking at a strategy that Paul uses to himself effectively pursue God's mission of helping more people know and serve God, more people know and serve God more, make more and better disciples. How did Paul, he's one of the authors in the New Testament, he wrote a lot of the books, letters in the New Testament, and his writings are really important to us. And so how did he pursue that mission? So we're going to look at what he wrote. We're going to see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 27. If you are using one of the Bibles that we provided from on the stools in the back, that's going to be on page 638. It's going to be on page 638, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 27. And so if you want to turn there, use your Bible apps on your phone to get there. If you're using the Bible app on your phone, we're going to be reading in the NIV. That'll help you follow along if you want. But so last week we read 2 passages that really should be at the top of every church's list of key verses, key passages, theme verses. Acts chapter 1, verse 8, go into all the world, right, to Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth, and be my witnesses. Matthew 28, 19 to 20, sometimes we call that the Great Commission. Go into all the world and make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them to obey. Well, we're going to go for the trifecta today and add to that this passage, because I believe 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 27 should also be at the top of that list. That we should read these verses regularly and often, because it will help us keep focused on the why. Why are we here, and why, and how do we be effective? So here's what Paul says, and what Paul lays out as the practical biblical strategy of pursuing the mission of helping more people know and serve him, of making more and better disciples, of reaching, rescuing, and reconciling. So we're going to start with 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 23. He says this. He says, though I am free and I don't belong to anyone, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. Verse 20, to the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those who are under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law. Though I'm not free from God's law, I'm under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. He says, if I could summarize those verses, 19 to 23, he says this. He says, I make myself a slave of all to rescue more for the sake of the gospel. The reason I do this is because I want to rescue more for the sake of the gospel. And so let's kind of work backwards through this a little bit. First, Paul says that the gospel is his number one priority. Verse 23, I do all this for the sake of the gospel. And the gospel is his number one priority. And that's what we've been saying for the last 2 weeks. The number one priority is the gospel. And everything Paul does, he says, is because of that priority. I do everything that I do because of the gospel. Everything for the sake of the gospel. Why? Because the gospel saves. The gospel rescues. Because the gospel, the reality and the danger of sin, and the rescue that Jesus provides, the gospel is the power of God for salvation. Because the gospel is the message of reconciliation. Because the gospel changes everything. The gospel makes you a new person, because the gospel, that message transfers people from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of the Son of God. Because it calls people into God's marvelous light and invites them to walk in the light just like Jesus is in the light. Because the gospel, the good news, is the message of rescue, that sin is the dangerous reality that every single person lives with. That sin is a condition, and it's polluting our present and our eternal future. It's causing us to offend God now and to do wrong now, but it's also stolen our eternal future and our hope of an eternal relationship with God. It's causing death and then separation, but the gospel is the message of rescue. That Jesus offers rescue from the consequences of sin and from the power of sin, and that he offers reconciliation, right, from the corruption of sin, meaning he fixes things as we grow from the corruption of sin. And that message, when preached in cooperation with the Holy Spirit, saves. And so Paul says, my number one priority is getting the message of rescue and reconciliation to people, because it saves. And I want it to save as many people as possible. If that message saves, I want as many people as can hear it as possible. I want to be a partner. That's what he says at the end of verse 23. I do this for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings. What he really means is, I want to be a partner with these people. I want to partner with them to help them rescue, but also to help reconcile them. I want to partner with as many people as possible in their rescue and in their reconciliation. I want to form partnerships with people and help them work through their relationship with God, and help them fix all of those broken pieces in that relationship, with all those things that were corrupted through the cancer of sin. We want to wipe away those stains. I want to partner with people in that, not just to rescue them. I want to partner with them in their reconciliation. The gospel saves, and that's his number one priority. So what's the strategy then, Paul? So if that's your number one priority and you want to see as many people as possible rescued and reconciled, what's the strategy? The strategy is, verse 19, to become a slave to all. That's what he says. The strategy is, I want to become a slave to all. And so this sounds bad at first. When you first read this, right, you become a slave to everybody. So if I say, hey, Paul, go get me a drink, you're going to go get me a drink? Is that how this works? When I worked at Bethany Camp, Joel Hart, who used to be the program director there, and we had this little thing going where we played ping pong. It sounds cooler if you say table tennis because you sound better at it. So we played table tennis a lot, and we always had this deal that whoever lost, we always bet drinks at lunch, and so whoever lost would always have to go get the other one drinks whenever they would want to. But we would play double or nothing and stuff, and so we would increase the number of meals that we would have to do it for. I'm not sure we ever actually fully ended. I don't even remember who had the final tally, but that's not what he's talking about, right? I'm gonna do whatever you ask me to. I'm gonna become a slave because this is what he means. What he means is when he says, I want to become a slave to all, he means I'm here to serve you in any way possible that will help bring you to salvation. I want to serve you in any way that will help foster a relationship, build a relationship that will bring you to rescue. And so I'm going to be a slave to anybody. Serve them in any way that's necessary that will help bring them to salvation. He's saying the strategy is to adapt to the situational realities of the culture that he finds himself in. The strategy is to become all things to all people. That's what he says in verse 22. I become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. Not meaning he's going to be a jack of all trades and he's going to add everything he possibly can to who he is. Not a jack of all trades, no. But he's saying, I'll do whatever's necessary, short of sin, in order to see more people saved. Because the gospel is most important, because salvation is most important. And so I'll do whatever it takes, whatever is necessary, whatever it requires, short of sin, in order to see people saved. And so he gives examples. So we see examples here in verses 20 to 22. He gives examples of what he means. He says in verse 20, so when I'm in a Jewish culture with unsaved Jews, and that's important to remember, he's in a Jewish culture with unsaved Jews. He says, I become like a Jew so that I can win Jews. I adapt to Jewish culture, a culture based on the Old Testament law, so that there wouldn't be anything that would distract them from the message of rescue and reconciliation. I want to become like a Jew so that unsaved Jews won't be distracted from my message. I want them to hear very clearly what they need to hear that will bring them to rescue. So I don't want to do something in their culture that will confuse them or discourage them or prevent the message from being heard. Did he really do this? Yes, he really did this. So I'll give you one example for now. In the book of Acts, you don't have to turn there, I'll just describe it to you, but if you want to look it up later on and read it for yourself, it's Acts chapter 21, verses 20 to 26. This is just one example, but Paul in this passage is going to be ministering in the Jewish culture, and the local church that he's teaming up with is concerned that some of what he does is going to offend their culture, because Paul has been very open. Look, I don't have to follow the Jewish rules about what you eat and all those things. I don't have to follow those because I'm free. I'm free from those rules. And so this church is saying, look, if we want you to come minister with us, but if you come and do some of the things that you're used to doing, you're going to offend people in our culture because it's a Jewish culture. And he's brought with him Jewish Christians who have been saved, who have come to rescue from their sin, but they live with non-Jews in their town, and so they've been living like non-Jews because that's how their culture is. But now they're in a Jewish culture, and the church that they're coming to minister with is basically worried, like, okay, very practically, and then you'll read this if you're looking in these passages. In our culture, long hair is offensive. Long hair is a no-no in our Jewish culture, and so please, can you cut your hair if you're gonna, because it's gonna throw people off if you've got long hair. And please don't walk around eating bacon and then shaking hands, because that's going to mess with people. In fact, your hands are probably not kosher because you've been doing this for a while, and because you haven't been following these rules for a long time. So could you fix that for us before you come minister to our culture? And Paul says, does Paul say, hey, look, guys, we're Christians. We don't have to follow Jewish rules, so I'm not cutting my hair, and I'm going to eat bacon, and they're going to have to deal with it. No, he says, hey, that's the culture, so I'll do whatever it takes. To the Jews, I'll become like a Jew. If that means I'm going to reach them with the message of salvation, I'll do it. And so he and those guys, they cut their hair and they wash their hands, and they stop eating that meat. They perform the purifications, and then they let everybody know, hey, we're going with what you're doing here. We're not going to eat any of that meat. We cut our hair, and the reason is because they wanted to win as many as possible. They didn't want to get in the way of the message of rescue. Are these guys going to miss meat? Probably. Did they like their hair? I'd guess they probably did, because they grew it out, right? And they're probably going to wish that they hadn't had to cut it, but it's worth the sacrifice to win more. And in fact, earlier in Acts, one guy, Timothy, who works with Paul, he went so far as to get circumcised for this very reason. Because in that culture, he didn't want to make anybody get confused about what the real message of rescue was about. Did he have to? No. But by not doing it, he risked the effectiveness of the gospel and the culture, so he did. Crazy. But that was with the Jews. Paul did this with non-Jews too. So those are examples of what he did with the Jews. He said that the Jews, I became like a Jew because I want to reach them. I want to be effective with them. But he also did this with non-Jews. When Paul was in modern-day Turkey, we just spent a long time talking about this church in Galatia. When he was in modern-day Turkey, when there were no Jews around, he ate whatever meat there was. He didn't practice the Jewish Sabbath celebrations and the Jewish Sabbath regulations. Why? So that he might win more, so he could relate to those people at their dinner tables. In Acts chapter 17, Paul is in Athens, Greece, and he starts speaking with the people of Greece, these Greeks, these men that live in Athens. And in order to make his point, Paul quotes their own poets in order to make a point about the gospel. He quotes secular poets, something you'd never do in Jewish culture. But in Greek culture, that's a huge assist to the effectiveness of the gospel. Why would he do that? To win as many as possible. Basically, what Paul says is, look, whatever it takes to bring people to rescue and salvation, I want to do it. I'll adapt to it. My only rule is, my one condition is, I'm not going to sin. That's my condition. That's my one rule. I'm not going to sin. I won't sin because that's what some people are thinking, right? Wait a second. Not everything is on the table. You can't do anything and just say, well, this is for the gospel. It's going to help people come to salvation. You can't do whatever it takes, and that's true. You can't. You can't do whatever it takes. You can't do anything and say, hey, I'm reaching more people, so this is okay, right? Because Paul even says, look, so what then? Should we continue to sin more and more and more so grace abounds? No, we can't. That's foolishness. That doesn't make any sense. Let's not get crazy with it, right? So there are some things that Paul wouldn't be able to do because it's sin. That's what he says. Look in verse 21, right? He says, so to people who don't have the law, I became like one not having the law, but I'm not free from God's law. I can't sin, right? I'm under Christ's law. I can't sin. I can't do anything it takes to reach people. But I want to do whatever it takes except sin. And so that's what he says, right? The strategy doesn't mean that I'm free from God's law, from Christ's law. It doesn't mean that I can sin and then use the gospel as an excuse. It means the reason I'm free is so I can pursue the gospel in any situation apart from sin. I'll do anything short of sin to reach people with the gospel, rescue, and reconciliation. So Paul, would you have a drink with someone if they wanted to talk about the Bible, or if it would help them move forward in their reconciliation? Yeah, I would. Paul, would you party until you got drunk to establish a reputation and relationship that might open conversations? No, absolutely not, because the Bible says not to. Paul, would you go over for dinner at your same-sex neighbor's house to build a relationship and open a door for the gospel? Yeah, I would. Paul, would you marry a same-sex couple to open a door for the gospel? No, I wouldn't. I won't do it. Because I'll do whatever it takes, but I'm not going to sin. I'm not going to sin and violate what the gospel, the Bible says is right. The strategy is anything short of sin to reach people with the gospel, to adapt to the non-sinful aspects of the culture because the gospel saves. And that's what Paul did over and over and over again. That's what he did. And we'd all agree, to be honest with you, we would all agree this makes a really great missionary. Makes an incredible missionary. This is what we hope our missionaries do, is that they go over to a foreign culture, a foreign country, and they adapt to that culture. They wear what that culture would wear, they eat what that culture would eat, and they become a part of that culture, and they integrate themselves, and so that the only thing that prevents people from really responding to the message of rescue is the message of rescue. Right? We would expect that of our missionaries. In fact, we would be like, wait a second, you've lived in Africa for 10 years and you've never once put on what they wear and never once gone to somebody's house and eaten food with them. You always expect them to come to you and eat your food, and you've never actually adapted their culture. We would be upset with a missionary like that. We'd say, why not? Are you learning their language? Are you learning their customs? Right? This is what we love. We love what the Allens are doing in Papua New Guinea, right? Because they are becoming a part of that culture. We love what the Cooks are doing in Portugal because they're becoming a part of that culture. And they're saying, like, we want to learn what speaks, what communicates clearly to these people, what can't we do that we're used to doing, and what should we do that we might not be used to doing. When I was in Mexico for a couple of missions trips, I went there twice. And what we did, this was when I was in high school, once when I was in high school, once when I was in college, we went down to Tijuana, Mexico, Baja, California, and we built houses for people through this mission. It's called Mexican Caravan Ministries. And we built these houses for people, which were really just 12 by 12 or 12 by 16 sheds. We would build them in a day. And we would go down there, but one of the things that they kept telling us, these people live, the mission that we went to be a part of lives in this neighborhood, in this culture, in this community. And all of their people, like, they speak Spanish, not as a native language, but they learn Spanish, all the people that work there. But they spend a lot of time in these people's houses, following up with them after the houses are built, and they go back again and again and again. They eat a lot of their meals out in the community, not at the mission, or they invite people into the mission and have meals there. And so one of the things they told us is they said, look, it doesn't matter what they serve you, you have to eat it. It doesn't matter what they offer you, you've got to try it. Because we don't want to have to come up behind you and pick up your pieces because they say, man, these Americans are really offensive, they won't even try our food, when they're giving you maybe their food for the next 3 days because they want you to have it. And so there was one time we had this soup. Oh, it was rough. I remember looking at it thinking, oh no. And so I was one of the few in our groups that spoke Spanish enough, and so I just very casually asked our host, hey, what's in the soup? And they told me that they'd already used up the rest of their meat for the day, and so it was the stomach of sheep. They had cut up and put in this broth, and it was little chunks of sheep stomach. And so I thought, you know what, I'm not going to tell anybody else what this is. We're just going to go for it. And it was rough, but we ate it. Because that's what you expect of somebody that goes into a culture like that. You adapt and you want to relate to them, and it makes them that much more willing to listen to you when they see that you're trying. This is a strategy that we must adopt as individuals, as Christians, that we see where people are at and meet them there. You know, when I was in college, I've told you this story before, I worked at an after-school program, and for whatever reason, a number of my coworkers were Indian, not American Indian. And they had, at one point, we were working and really building relationships with them, and they it got to the point where we were close enough that one of my coworkers invited me and my friend to what she called her holy dance. Holy, H-O-L-I, not H-O-L-Y. You ever seen, I might be wrong on this now, but I believe their holy celebrations are the ones where they throw colored powder on each other. If you ever seen that in India, they're all covered. We didn't do that. But they invited us to do this holy celebration. And so we were like, we had a long discussion about this. Like, okay, is this okay for us to go to? Or are we going to be like worshiping, one of their gods if we go to this thing? And so my friend and I both, we kind of worked through this, and we said, look, if we don't go, we might, like, this might be our chance. This might be our opportunity. And so we went with in mind, thinking we just don't want to sin while we're there. And so we went. We were a part of what they were doing. We didn't do their dances because we weren't quite sure what they would interpret that from us to mean. Like but we went, and it was a lot of fun, and really went a long way with our relationship with Lena. We've got to adapt, right, and to those cultures and say, listen, anything short of sin, I want to do if it's going to help me be more effective in our relationship, so that the person that I care about is going to be that much closer to hearing and responding to the message of rescue. Or if one of my friends has just recently responded to the message of rescue and it helps me help them in their reconciliation, I want to do it. I want to do that. We require our missionaries to embrace the non-sinful aspects of culture and contextualize the gospel so that it makes sense. And we are missionaries in our culture. We are missionaries in our culture. And if we're going to say that we're a worshiping church and make more disciples, then we have to act like missionaries. We have to start seeing ourselves as individually missionaries. I once heard a youth pastor that I really respected in high school. I heard him say it this way, and it's always really stuck with me. We always assume people are called to be missionaries to go to the mission field, and that's true. I think there is something inside them that the Holy Spirit wakens and says, I want you to go to this culture. But what this youth pastor said is, and it's always stuck with me, he said, look, really, truly, the call is not to go. You've got to be called to stay, because we are all called to be missionaries. The call really isn't to go. The call is to stay, because we're all called to be missionaries in our culture. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. We have to act like missionaries, and it's got to be our strategy, a biblical strategy as a church to reach our culture. We've got to start thinking that way. We've got to do the same. So I want to talk for a moment then just about our culture. So you really understand your neighbors, understand our neighbors, understand where we live, really truly live in Erie, Pennsylvania today. So I want to talk about our culture realities. I heard another pastor call these cultural challenges. So these are the challenges that you face as an individual in reaching your friends, reaching your neighbors, reaching your community, and challenges that we face as a church in reaching our neighbors, reaching those who are close to us but far from God, and pursuing God's mission of helping more people know and serve Him. And so the first one I call the American challenge. First one is the American challenge. This is the reality that we live in today, and we can complain about it because sometimes it's easy to be like, man, because it is frustrating to see happen, but it's also the reality. And so we can see it as a challenge or see it as a frustration and not deal with it. But 26% of Americans are religiously unaffiliated. I'll explain what that means. But 26% of Americans are religiously unaffiliated. What that means is 1 out of 4 Americans claim that to be unreligious, or really, it'd be better to say that they're religiously ambiguous. Religiously ambiguous. What that means is they don't care one way or another. They don't care what religion it is. They don't really, just as long as, you've heard this expression probably, as long as you have faith, right? As long as you have faith. 26% of Americans don't care one way or another what religion or what you believe. They're religiously unaffiliated. That doesn't mean they don't believe in God. It just means that they don't believe in a specific church. Church really isn't useful to them. You see them on TV all the time thanking God for a touchdown, or thanking God for an Academy Award. award. They're religiously unaffiliated. They don't care one way or another. They just think that a belief, a faith is okay. 33% of those people, a third of them, are under the age of 30 that are religiously unaffiliated, religiously ambiguous, that as long as you have faith, then that's okay. That's 1 out of 4 Americans believe that. The second challenge, and we'll come back to that because it affects things. The second challenge is what we call the generational challenge. The generational challenge. So this is a study, there's a study done by a nonprofit organization called Pew Research, and they conduct all sorts of surveys about religion and things like that. So this survey was about church attendance based on generation and which generations attend church the most and how that's declining. And so here's what they found. These are the most recent numbers. So they gave them the names. I didn't come up with these names. They gave them these names. The one that really confuses me is the silent generation, but the name, I mean. But the greatest generation, so those born before 1928, 56% of them attend church regularly. 56% attend church regularly of those born before 1928. Of those born between 1928 and 1945, the silent generation, 44% attend church regularly. It's a pretty decent number, 44%. Of the boomer generation, and so we might be starting to speak to your peers now and your group. Of the boomer generation, 1946 to 1964, 32% attend church regularly. And when we say regularly, we mean more or less every week or so. Generation X, those born between 1965 and 1980, 27% attend church regularly. And then this is the most recent generation, and we can argue with the dates if you want to argue with the dates and the names, but the statistics, the percentages are more important. The millennial generation, those born after 1981, 18% attend church regularly. 18% of the millennial, compare that to the greatest generation, 56% attend church regularly, and that is a vast difference. That is a lot of people. What this means is that if this trend continues, then we're within 2 generations of hardly anyone in that generation going to church regularly. My kids' generation, your grandkids or your great-grandkids, almost no one from their generation will attend church. That's a problem. The third challenge that we face is, this is not my term for it, but I liked how they said it, so we call it the pre-evangelism challenge. The pre-evangelism challenge, meaning what is the background of the person that you're talking? If you were to meet somebody on the street today, what is their experience? What are the odds their experience of church is? Where do you have to start with them? Do I have to start with who God is, or can I just start with what Christ did on the cross? Like, where do I need to start with people? That's what that means, a pre-evangelism. How much background information do they already have? Where can I start with them? So it's important to know what their background is. So do you start with who Jesus is? Do you start with creation, or do you start with crucifixion? How far along is our culture in that sense? So in 1970, the average person attended church, read their Bible, believed in a Bible-based morality, even believed in Jesus' death, believed in heaven, believed in hell in 1970. And so their need, that pre-evangelism, what that means is their need for somebody to respond to the message of rescue, their need was really just to get the information they already knew in their head to their heart, to belief. And so they just really needed a nudge or two to get there. So what that meant was, what was really effective in that day in 1970s, also because of the culture and and how it was, is that door-to-door evangelism was very effective, because everybody was kind of starting on the same page. Everybody was in the same place mentally in their understanding of God. You weren't starting. Imagine knocking on somebody's door and then having to start with creation. Do you have 6 hours where I can explain to you how things started, and eventually after about 4 hours I'll get to my point? right? But it was very effective in the 1970s, those time periods, because people were very familiar with church. They were very familiar with its messages, very familiar with its themes, with its language. In 2015, this is the most recent data that we have, the average person didn't attend church, and the average person didn't read their Bible, didn't have a Bible. The morality of the average person isn't based at all on the Bible. People aren't Bible literate. They aren't familiar with church, with its messages, with its language, with its themes. In fact, in 2015, 46% of Americans admitted that they go to church less than 2 times a year. 46% of Americans, almost half of Americans, admitted that they only go to church 2 times a year, which means they know about Jesus' birth and they know about Jesus' death, because it's probably Christmas and Easter. Actually, not even his death, his resurrection, really. That means they have a very low Bible context. And that also means that their kids for sure have no idea, because they're not getting it at home. No context. What that means is they need hundreds of nudges and investments over a long period of time to get people to at the point where they're ready to respond to the message of rescue. That means that we have to take that into account when we interact with them if we want to be effective. I want to give you the 4th challenge here. And the 4th challenge is what I call the Erie challenge. This is where we get even more personal to where we are. So there's a group called the Barna Group. They do another nonprofit organization that do a lot of polls. And some of these numbers are going to be familiar to you, but we cannot ignore them. So they have this survey out, and they call it's about America's most Bible-minded cities. Bible-minded meaning that they ask people throughout America's 100 biggest cities 2 questions. They ask them 2 questions. 1, do you read the Bible regularly? Now, this is going to be people's what they admit, right? Which means it's probably it's probably lower than what people admit, because you don't want to sound bad, right? So they ask people by their own admission, do you read the Bible regularly, and do you believe the Bible is accurate in the principles it teaches? So do you believe the Bible, and do you trust the Bible? That's what they're asking them. And these are the results. Of the 100 largest cities in America, the most Bible-minded were Chattanooga, Birmingham, Roanoke, Virginia, and Shreveport, Louisiana. And there was another place that it was called Tri-Cities, Tennessee, which is like Bristol area, Tennessee. In those cities, in those 4 cities, they were the top of Bible-minded. In those cities, half of the people, 1 out of 2 people in those cities, admitted they read the Bible regularly and believed it to be accurate and true. What that means is, 1 out of every 2 people, what that means is, even if you're not one of those 2 that reads the Bible regularly, you've heard people talking about it. That means that exposure is very high. People are familiar with the Bible. Everyone has exposure. If 1 out of 2 people believe it to be true, that means they talk about it. It comes up in conversation. That means really a lot of those people in those cities in the South have exposure. That's the South, right? The North is a different story. The North is a different story. At the bottom of the list, at number 96, we're just a little over 1 out of 10 people read the Bible regularly, admittedly, is Buffalo, New York. Just 2 hours from here. At number 78 is Cleveland, Ohio, and number 71 is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Both of those cities are just under 3 out of 10 people admit they read their Bible regularly and believe the Bible is true. Erie is too small to qualify, but we are smack dab in the middle of those 3. In fact, it would be a pretty safe assumption to say that in Erie, only 2 out of 10 people read the Bible regularly and believe that it's true. Of all the qualified cities in Pennsylvania, in our state, only Harrisburg made it to 25%. There's a lot of Amish over there. And that may have had an effect. only Harrisburg, of all the cities in Pennsylvania, only Harrisburg made it to 25%. Read a Bible regularly, and believe that it's true. But there's more. Thanks to government data, we know this, that there are 281,000 people in Erie County. In our county, there's 281,000 people. And of that number, 23,687 of them attend a gospel teaching church. That means, and you've seen this number before, and it's relevant and it must change us, 8.44% of our county goes to a gospel teaching church. In fact, 122,286 don't attend church at all. 44% of our county don't go to church at all. We're right there about the national average. The rest that do go to churches that don't teach the gospel. What that means is that there are 257,000 people in our county that need the gospel. 91.5% of our county needs the gospel. So the question is, since this is our reality, then how do we worship God by helping more people know and serve Him more in our culture, in Erie, Pennsylvania? How do we worship God by helping more people know and serve Him? And if 44% of our county doesn't attend church or have Bible familiarity, and the majority of ones that do are older than 45 years old, faced with these challenges, what do? I know what Paul would do. He says it in verses 24 to 27 of 1 Corinthians 9. He says this: do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. So I don't run like someone running aimlessly. I don't fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I preach to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. He says, run in a way to win the prize. Strategize, organize, contextualize, and plan so that you don't run aimlessly. So that you don't waste your time and disqualify yourself from being heard because you haven't adapted, because you haven't adjusted, and you haven't planned to the culture that you're in. Do whatever it takes within the rules, apart from sin, to win the prize. What is the prize? More people. And not just more people for a number. No, Paul says, I want more people to partner with. I want more people to be invested in, to share in the gospel with, to not only rescue, but also to reconcile. The point isn't a number. The point is a changed life. You don't want to miss out on a partnership that fosters rescue and reconciliation. But that means in our culture, you have to go to them because they're not just going to wander in. So Paul would say, if that's the culture that we live in, then you had better be willing to sacrifice and adapt to reach it. In 1 Corinthians 14, again, you can read that one later on too if you want, but in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul confronts a church in Corinth, in a city in Greece, because their expressions of worship in their meetings are all over the place. They're all over the place. And his two biggest issues, his two biggest rebukes of this church can be summarized in this way. He says, one, guys, your expressions of worship, what you do as a church, preaching, praising, communion, specifically in that church, they've got to be unselfish, because it's not about you. It's about God's design and mission for the church. It's about celebrating Him, and what you do has to be unselfish. And the other thing that he says is, so one, you're being selfish in how you express your worship, but two, he says, it's got to be intelligible. It's got to be easy to understand, not only by the church people present, but also by non-church people present. Because here's the reality: if you're really pursuing God's mission for you as an individual, if you're really pursuing God's mission as a church, then there should always be guests present, because they follow you back. They should be seeking God out. And so he says, look, your expressions of worship, they have to be first and foremost unselfish, and they've got to be understandable, because there better be guests present if you're pursuing God's mission. So let me give you one more group of statistics. And this is what I call the Bethel reality, because this is where we're at, the Bethel reality. And I see this as a lot of potential. Down our hallway where our kids worship, throughout the week, we have contact with 55 daycare families every single day. They are very representative of the culture God has placed our church in. Of those 55 daycare families, 19 of them are churched. Kate and I are one of them, which means that 34 of those families and their kids are not churched. And because they live in Erie County, we can assume some things about them. They don't read the Bible. They don't know the Bible. They don't have much context for it because their parents probably didn't go to church more than 2 times a year. And the same is true for your neighbors, the people that live next door to you. It means if those families do come to church, if your neighbors do come to church, it might be their first time in a church ever. So the question is, how are we going to help them know and serve God? How are we going to partner in their rescue? I think Paul would say, well, this one's easy. We adapt to our cultural realities in the church just like we do outside the church. If we adapt to it outside the church, then we adapt to it inside the church. If this affects how we pursue the mission as individuals, then it should logically affect us as a church when we meet, because our strategy shouldn't just change overnight between Saturday and Sunday. If I'm going to meet people where they are at throughout the week and they follow me back, I want to meet them where they're at on Sunday, because we need to stay consistent. So Paul would say, let's do whatever it takes short of sin to reach these people. Let's not create a culture inside these walls that they have no idea how to even relate to us, because that means that they won't hear the message of rescue or reconciliation, and that's the number one priority, because the gospel saves, because the message of rescue and reconciliation saves. We should do whatever we can to make sense to them, because what's most important is that they hear the message. Did you know, adding to our reality, that on average, we have 3 to 4 guests here every single Sunday, first or second time. And based on the statistics of our county and on our country, the odds are very good that they have very little to no background in church. Are we going to run aimlessly, or are we going to run the race with the purpose of winning the prize and becoming partners in the gospel? So why not sing songs that they can understand and catch on to quick, songs that they'll hear on the radio? Why not use a translation that is clear and makes the most sense to someone who has no Bible background at all? So when they read on their own, they can still understand it. I think that's discipleship. Giving people tools that they can use when they leave and understand when they come. It's discipleship. Why not do church in a way that will make sense to them so that we can become partners with them in the gospel? I think that's what Paul would do. So what does this mean? It means that if we were in the South with 1 out of 2 Bible familiarity, we would relate to our culture different as individuals and as a church, and so that would cause us to do church differently in the South. That's what it means, because the culture is different there. It means that if we were in Africa, we would do this differently. We would relate differently. We do church differently, but we're in the Northeast United States, in Erie County, in Erie, Pennsylvania. So that should affect what we do as individuals with our neighbors, but then as a church when they come back with us. So that we be most effective in our mission of making more and better disciples, helping more people know and serve God more. It means, like Paul, we made a commitment to being contemporary as a church, not rock concert contemporary. That's not what we said. I think that would be confusing, and I think it would hinder the understanding of the gospel. No, when I say contemporary, what I mean is current to our culture, relatable, relevant. It means that the mission never changes, but the methods we use can and must change. Why? Because the way we used to do it was wrong? No. It was effective. It was very effective, but culture was different then. culture changes. It means that in 10 years, I hope that we won't be doing it the same as we are today. Does that mean the way that we do it today is wrong? No. It means that in 10 years, probably no one will go to church unless we start today. We want to be relevant and understandable. It means that we value the truth. We already said we value the authority of the Bible, and we think the Bible changes everything about us and is useful for us in any situation. And it means that we value the truth and authority and usefulness of the Bible so much that we don't want anything else to get in the way of that, so that we won't be disqualified when we preach it because it becomes confusing. So for instance, we use modern songs with modern lyrics and melodies, but we follow Paul's instructions in Colossians 3:16 that the content must be scriptural, it must be theological, and it must give expression to our faith. Because as Christians, we need that outlet to express our worship together, and so that we're not compromised. So we're not compromising the message, but it needs to be understandable and communicate well in our culture. So we use a version of the Bible that makes sense to people who are unfamiliar with the Bible, but we don't want to water down the truth because some of us need meat, not milk. The same is true with our preaching. What it means is that we run our race as Bethel Baptist Church in a way that will give us the best opportunity to win the prize. It means that to partner and disciple people in today's culture, we have to do it in a way that is adapted to our culture. As individuals, when we join them for dinner, and as a church when they join us for our service. And it means that we should say thank you to you, because you are partners in this mission. You are the church. So personally, I want to say thank you, because the first time I wore jeans on this stage, it probably made some of you who have been in church for a long time uncomfortable. But I hope you get why we do it. And I know that some of you might not love the style of music, but you sing. And you take the opportunity to praise and celebrate alongside us. Thank you. And some of you might prefer a different version of the Bible, but you still come to learn and come to be challenged. And so we want to make sure we say thank you so much for being a committed partner in the mission. I don't think God is done with Bethel. I think God is just starting with Bethel. And I don't look at those statistics as discouraging. I look at them as potential. And there are people down that hall. There are people next door. There are people down the road. There are people sitting on the couch in your own living room that need to hear the message of reconciliation and rescue. Our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, our family, and they need us to stay on our toes and running the race so that more people will know and serve God more. And so I'll tell you this, as you invest and sacrifice to reach those who are close to you but far from God, at some point I pray that when your friend comes to church, when your family member comes to church for the first time, that they will leave saying, I liked the music and I enjoyed the service, then that means they might just come back. We want to be a church where your children and your grandchildren want to attend. And so we're committed to making sure that your friend's first time makes sense to them, because we both so desperately want them to hear the gospel without distraction, without confusion, because we want to partner with them, not just in their rescue, but with their reconciliation. And so, like I said at the beginning, or towards the end, thank you for your partnership. I think there's so much potential here. Please join me. Please join us. We want to partner with you. Reach our culture, reach those friends, reach those people who are close to you but far from God. I love you guys. And I love this church. And I love those people because God loves them. So what do? it takes, because the gospel saves. Pray with me. God, would you bind us together and unify us in purpose and in mission? Would you help us to see how we can sacrifice for our neighbors, for our family members, to help them understand better who you are, so that nothing will distract them from the message when it's spoken, because that's what's most important, because the gospel saves. Would you help us to seek those out, just like you did, who are lost, who are far from you. Help us to go and find them and be ready for them when they come. Help us to experience the joy as an individual of seeing someone come to know you. Help us to experience the joy and celebration as a church of seeing more people come to know you. Helping us to see more people serve you, to see people taking steps in victory in their lives as they reconcile their life to you. I want to be a partner with people in that. I want our church to be a partner with people in that, God. Would you please give us the grace and opportunity to do that, so that we can celebrate every Sunday that lives are being changed, and that we can see our neighbors being changed, our friends being changed, our coworkers being changed, our family being changed. I love you, God. I know you love the church. So we want to celebrate you, even in the song here as we close. I pray this in your name. Amen. Can I ask you to stand with us? And can we together use the words of this song to celebrate and challenge ourselves and challenge each other with the truth that's in it? You give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our
our time to give thanks to God for what He's done for us. I'll ask the ushers to come forward, and we're going to give thanks to God right now. Father, we thank you that you are a great, great God, and you love us. Father, help us to love you as you love us. Thank you for what you've given to us. Father, as we give back a portion of what you've given to us, we ask your blessing upon it as you have continued to bless us. Lord, we give you thanks for how you have blessed this church. And we ask, Father, your blessing upon this offering we take right now, that it might reach this area and other areas of this world, Lord, where we've committed to support our missionaries as well, and ask that you would save many through the gospel as it's preached each day, each week. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Just 3 reminders for you this morning before we go, and I hope that you don't all just go right away. I'll talk about that announcement in just a moment, but I'll just remind you that Pastor Tim needs to know if you're going to help with this Saturday as we serve at Bethany Camp. So remember that. A week from Wednesday, we'll be doing the always forget its name, but we go over to the Erie Heights and hand out food for Second Harvest Food Bank, but it's Produce Express, as I finally remember it. And so just a reminder about that. Now, the reason I don't want you all to leave just before, just as we dismiss here, is we have a business meeting coming up. We'll give a few reports. It will be brief, we promise, and we will get out the message of what God is doing right now, and we'll give a brief message on the search committee report as well. So we're glad to have you today. Lord bless you.